Thank you. I've said it before, but I love living in the Palouse because talking about the weather is a legitimately interesting conversation. I love talking about the weather. It's awesome. You know it's hot when you call your wife and you say, "Hey, I'm going to bring. Can you turn the oven on to 425?" And she's like, "Oh, you're bringing home pizza?" "No, but I'm cooking." I'm going to open that door and just stand in front of it to cool off. So it's going to be pretty warm. So the good news is we're in a nice air-conditioned space. We got lots of room, lots of great air. I've got about 2 hours worth of material, and we're going to keep you guys cool for a while. Usually if I say something like that, people would be like, no, I got a roast in the oven. I got to get home, get that out. Right now you're like, no, I got a roast sitting on the counter. I need to get that out. I was going to get overcooked just sitting there, so. All right. So, enough about the weather. It is funny, though, a little bit later this week, it might actually be hotter than somewhere you really don't want to go. Okay. So, do you have or have you ever had some sort of resource or some sort of possession that once it was used up, it was gone? That was it. It's over. Irreplaceable. Nothing you could do to get it back. I don't know. It's hard to think about, really, because in America, almost everything seems to be replaceable, right? We have so many options to replace things. Even some of our largest possessions, we might think about, oh, yeah, my car. I wouldn't be able to replace that, if it got wrecked, but the insurance that I pay for probably could. Or even our home, that would be a huge investment that if it burned down, as tragic as that would be, we probably would end up being able to replace it because we have insurance. So there's a sense of this, of ease that we have, that we can live with knowing it'll probably be replaced. In most cases, even some of the biggest things that we could think of. Maybe something that you have that is of great value to you might even be your education here in our community. We have a highly educated community. But yet, if you use that, it only grows. It doesn't really go away, right? So that doesn't really fit. Maybe it's even our health. There's lots of times we feel like things happen in our health that seem like they're completely out of our control. Maybe that fits the category. Maybe we even think a little more philosophically about maybe our time. Okay, obviously, we can never get our time back, right? It's kind of a loosely, we could say that's a resource. It's not something we have or possess, but we do use it or invest it or spend it or whatever. So this week in our Bible reading, as we've been reading through Matthew, right? We've been finishing up Matthew. And just a note here, we are almost exactly halfway through 2021. So are you halfway through your Bible reading schedule? Okay, I'm not. I'm a little bit backed up, but that's okay because I'm going to keep cruising through. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, as a church, we have a Bible reading schedule to take us through the New Testament and part of the Old Testament. And so if you want to do that with us, start at July 1st, and you're going to be right on schedule, okay? And we're going to read, continuing on through the end of the year, and you can get that schedule. It's there's probably hard copies up there at the receptionist desk, but you can get it on our app, right? So get that and read with us, because if we are followers of Jesus, we really need to know what he said. So, this week we read a story that I want to talk about. And this story is probably one that is talked about frequently, so hopefully it's kind of fresh in your mind. And it's possibly one that is talked about so frequently that when we read it, we kind of just cruise on through. If you've read it a number of times, you go, okay, great, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this is found in Matthew 26, 6 through 16. I'm going to read the whole story here. It's about 10 verses. And then we're going to go through this in a bit of a more orderly fashion. I'm going to have some context, and we're going to read through these scriptures several times. Okay, so maybe a little bit different format of a message. This is a bit more of an expository message where I'm going to be going through the scripture and highlighting some different facts and nuances as we go through, and then at the end there we're going to have a few takeaways. And so if you're one of those people that's like, where are my takeaways? They're coming, okay? Just hang in there. There might be a few slipped in along the way, but we're definitely got some plan for the end, okay? So Matthew 26, 6 through 16. I'm going to read this here. So, while Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price, and the money given to the poor." Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." So that's why we're doing it right now. We're supposed to remember. So then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Okay, so I want to start here by highlighting, we're going to take a little bit of a step back, and we're going to look at, okay, this passage, it's in the book of Matthew, and the Matthew is one of the 4 Gospels, right? So I want to look at a little bit as, why do we have 4 Gospels? What is how some of the nuances, some of the facts, and some of what we know historically speaking about these different accounts, okay? And then we're going to look at this particular story in the 3 Gospels that it's actually recorded in, okay? So something to keep in mind. So the Gospels that were written, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all considered what's called the Synoptic Gospels, and they are recorded from somewhat of a historical perspective. They're recording historical facts. All the while, they certainly have a bias. Okay, these men who are recording these events of Jesus' life, they're recording it with the intent of not only saying what he did, but why, and morally, the theological and moral concepts as well. John, the other of the 4 Gospels, is written differently. Okay, he introduces a bit more of a personal aspect. He's less concerned with historical facts and details and more concerned with the people and Jesus and the thoughts and the intents of people's hearts as they go through these events. You can kind of get a flavor for that. You know, John 3:16 says what? "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son," right? It's a common verse that we'll hear it a lot in church. So that's written in the Gospel of John. So he's talking about an event. Yes, God did give his son, that whoever would believe in him would have eternal life. But he's recording it from a heart perspective. God so loved. Do you see the difference? Okay, it's not just an event, it's actually this other perspective. So it's important to recognize some of the differences in these authors and how they are trying to reach their target audience. Okay? So these historians, they communicated the events of the past so that the readers or hearers in the present could learn positive examples to follow and negative examples to avoid. And they used the facts of history to communicate moral, political, or theological ideas and emphases. And an important aspect of this is the readers or hearers. So if we look into ancient times, so back when, most of these Gospels were written in the 1st century AD, so somewhere between 50 AD and then up to 90 AD or so, okay? So during that time, literacy would have been extremely low. Here, it's extremely high comparatively, right? So literacy would have been very low, so most people would not have been able to read a copy of the Gospel of Matthew. Additionally, they probably wouldn't even have access to a copy because they would have to be handwritten. And so what would happen is these manuscripts would go to a group of people in a church setting, and somebody would read it, and the hearers would have to memorize what they were hearing. When we plan messages for our hearers today, we try to think about, how am I going to say this in such a way that people are going to remember it? And you probably remember like 2% of what we say. Pastor Phil's, you probably remember 5 or 8%. The rest of us, it's, we're working our way there, right? It's like, you just don't retain it. Hopefully you retain the experience. Hopefully you have God speaks to you through the process, and that's what you go out with. And there's this aspect of life transformation and the renewing of our minds through the process, right? they literally couldn't refer back to the notes. They had to memorize it. And so when they would listen, they would have to listen intently enough to be able to say, okay, I get that story, not just the main concepts, but I can recite it. That would have been an aspect of this process. So ancient tradition reports that 2 of the gospel authors were eyewitnesses of the events they recorded. So that would be Matthew and John. We know those both were one of the 12. Each of them was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, okay? Ancient tradition also reports that Mark's gospel, it relies heavily on the eyewitness account of Peter. So none of these were written as they went. They were all recorded after the fact. You know, Jesus was crucified and resurrected in the early 30s AD, right? And these gospels were not recorded until 50 to 90. So it wasn't as they go. They weren't like just taking notes on their phone as they went. They were reciting the oral tradition, and these guys who were eyewitnesses from memory what had happened. Additionally, writing at the time was actually quite a project. So, today you might sit down at your computer and, boy, you can jam out a bunch of pages. It could be a bunch of nonsense, and it doesn't even matter because you could just keep on going. You could write page after page after page. And today it's costs almost nothing to write. Back then, there was no computer, there was no paper. They had to go down to the scroll shop and buy, the Papyrus Palace downtown and get a scroll to handwrite a manuscript. So how many mistakes can you make? Not very many. That also would, so the scope of what they were writing would be limited to the resources they had in order to be able to write on. They wouldn't have had unlimited resources. So if we look at Mark's gospel, it's almost exactly half the length of Matthew and Luke's gospels. Would kind of indicate a standard scroll length. And so if you think about it, when Mark and Peter were, they're recording, they weren't sitting down there at the coffee shop, Hebrews. Okay, and then what happened? And Peter's like, oh yeah, there's this one time we were sitting at a banquet and this girl, what was her name? I can't remember. She came in and she poured the oil on his head. Oh, huh? What? I can't believe it. Oh yeah. No, this is a serious project. It's more like building a house. Like you have to survey the resources you have. We got one scroll. Okay, how much ink do we have? Well, about a scroll's worth, Okay, so then you have to manage the project such that you get the most important things done, and some of the things you're going to intentionally leave out because you got limited space. So even God's holy word, he limited it to the resources that were available at the time. The miracle in that is it still speaks to us today. It's amazing, okay? So if we can look then at Matthew and go, well, it's conceivable he had more resources available to him because he was able to write more. It takes time. If you're in hand-to-mouth living, you're in subsistence living, if you're spending time writing, you're not baking bread or going out gathering food. And so that it costs a lot to produce this. It is not a flippant project. We're like, oh crud, we got to get this thing done, deadline's tomorrow. It was painstakingly detailed, extremely intentional. Both the details that were included and the details that were excluded was on purpose. So, Luke, the third synoptic gospel, he more directly tells us potential sources for his gospel. So, Luke, he wasn't one of the 12. He wasn't even with Jesus, as far as we know. Luke he never claims that. He doesn't claim to be an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry, but his work does imply that he traveled with Paul and spent up to 2 years in Judea. And this would give Luke ample time to check into sources such as the ones he mentions. So Luke in his gospel says, by the time Luke wrote, many had written about Jesus. There were lots of writings. And so he was able to refer to some of these writings and also the oral tradition of people who were eyewitnesses, and it's reasonable to think that he had access to some of the, probably the most prominent disciples, because we know if he was hanging out with Paul kind of was a mover and shaker, and he made sure that he found the right people to talk to. So, copies of written historical accounts, they would have been very limited, and the hearer's best option was for retaining the information was through their memorization. The practice of oral memory was most developed among disciples. So I'm not just referring to Jesus' disciples, but in general, the teachers of the day, they all would have advanced students who would be their disciples. Amongst that class of people, oral memorization was a skill that was extremely honed. Jesus' disciples would have told and retold these stories about Jesus, solidifying such accounts both in their memory and in the corporate memory of the early church. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they record the events of Jesus' life and ministry with the historical facts being preeminent, and John, in contrast, he appeals a bit more to the emotional and the relational aspects that he was tuned into. Additionally, it's believed that Mark's gospel was probably written first, and Matthew and Luke may have used an outline of Mark's gospel as they were going through and filling in the details of their stories. So what we're going to do here, now this is going to be really fun, okay? So this story about the woman and the alabaster jar, alabaster box, is recorded in 3 of the 4 gospels: Matthew, Mark, and John, okay? So we're going to read a congruent reading of these historical accounts, and we're going to weave these together, including the details from each account, okay? So what you're going to see, hopefully, is a more full picture of what was actually happening, and I think it's going to provoke some questions, and hopefully it does. I know it made a lot of questions for me, and so I'm going to let you know my questions, and then you'll have questions too. That'll be fun. Incidentally, Luke does not record this story. He does record a similar story. In Luke, his story, Jesus is at a banquet, and a woman comes in, and she anoints him with the perfume, and she brings the alabaster jar, pours the perfume on him. She washes his tears with her feet. And it seems like a lot of things really line up that this is the same story, just recorded in a different time. However, some significant differences that come up are, one, Luke's story actually happens about 2 years earlier than Matthew, Mark, and John's story. Jesus is in a different city. He's in Capernaum, whereas in Matthew, Mark, and John, he's in Bethany. And the message, probably most importantly, the message that Jesus speaks to those present is vastly different in Luke's story than it is in Matthew, Mark, and John's. And so it seems to indicate these are 2 different events, which is crazy in and of itself that this happens more than once. All the single guys hanging out with Jesus are like, this guy, am I right? Everywhere we go. Women throwing himself at his feet, He's not available, ladies. All right, so let's get into this a little bit. So I'm going to read, I broke this up into sections. So we have the event, and then we have the disciples' response. We have Jesus' response, and then Judas's response, okay? So I'm going to read the event from each of the 3 gospels it's recorded in. You listen for the differences or the similarities, okay? So here, Matthew 26, 6 through 7. It says, while Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. Mark, while he was in Bethany, reclining at the table, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. John, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So the first thing I notice here is Matthew and Mark say, a woman. A woman came to him. John specifically identifies the woman as Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. You know, don't you think it's a little ironic that Matthew, an eyewitness, and Mark, who's getting his information from Peter, didn't include her name? Surely they knew who Mary was. They're not sitting there going, what? You know that one girl? Martha. No, the other one. What was her name? Yeah. Can't remember. Let's move on. No, they knew who she was. Why wouldn't they include that detail? It's on purpose. For some reason, I don't know if we'll ever actually know. Maybe it's because she was still alive at the time that they were recording this. Wanted to keep her from the paparazzi? I don't know. I don't actually know, but I think it's really interesting. They allow a generality to be present. Okay, now, sometimes when it's general, it's easy for us to see our way into the story. Also, if the hearers of this story, their only hope is to memorize it, sometimes minute details like people's names might not be the best way to communicate. Because we got to get the most important information here, and that's a woman came and she gave this alabaster jar. Maybe that's how they could remember this story. They could take this story and apply it to them, and they could tell others about these are the life and times of Jesus. I don't know. There's some options. It says, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived. Okay, this is important because Lazarus was dead, but not anymore. So in John chapter 11, we need this backdrop to this scenario, because in John chapter 11, immediately preceding this story about Jesus at this banquet, is the story about Lazarus dying and Jesus going and raising him from the dead. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha are distraught, right? And so that could have represented a number of different things in their culture. There's no mention of their living parents. And there's no mention that either of these women are married. It's very possible that Lazarus was the financial means supporting Mary and Martha. And they worked as a family unit in their home. And when Lazarus died, that was devastating. Not just from a relational standpoint, of course it would be, but also from an economic standpoint. Now we have these two women who are going to be very vulnerable without a male heir in their home for protection and for provision. In that culture, that's not a great situation, okay? Lazarus is dead. The women are upset for a number of reasons. Not just our brother is gone, but we're in big trouble, okay? Jesus comes. They're a little bit upset with Jesus. How come if you were here, he wouldn't have died, And Jesus is visibly upset. This is where we get the verse where it says, Jesus wept. And then when he raises Lazarus from the dead, hope is restored. Not because it is this miraculous event that is like, wow, are you kidding me? Did that really just happen? But also, our future has now just changed. He gave us our life back that we just had lost. It is at a banquet in Jesus' honor. Few days later, could it be they're honoring him for this miracle? It's possible. It's possible. So they're in Bethany, where Lazarus lived. And it talks about how many people were coming to see him, to see Lazarus, because they heard, that guy was dead. Now he's back. Yeah. What did you see? How hot was it? Just curious. Hotter than Pullman in the summertime. Okay. All right. An alabaster jar or box, depending on the translation you're reading. So this is a really interesting thing. None of the Gospels give very much detail about this, probably because their intended audience would have understood it. They didn't need to explain what this meant. We sit here and go, what's the big deal? You go down to Walmart and get some more perfume. My gosh, I'm allergic to half of them. It's not the case in their culture. So this alabaster box, it was made of a hard marble, stone, which was very difficult to break open, designed to be open only once, most likely, by breaking the box itself. So either breaking off, the neck of it, possibly if it looked like this, or possibly shattering the entire unit such that it could no longer hold anything. Most likely, from a practical standpoint, you would think, it's probably you break off a portion of it and then it's just open and then you have to use it, as opposed to just shattering. It's not like she came and christened Jesus on the head, with this thing. He's not a ship, for crying out loud, okay? So this alabaster box, it was filled with a precious perfumed ointment called nard, which of course sounds really lovely. A sweet-smelling ointment from a plant in India carried overland to the Middle East. The scripture says it cost more than a year's wages. So that would be thousands of dollars, Fill it in for whatever you think it is. It's a lot. Pretty valuable. It was costly. Now, its value, it was not only because of the cost, but because of how it was used. Scholars tell us that a young girl would be given this box by her family when she reached marrying age, and then she would give it to her husband as a sign of her commitment and devotion to him. In a sense, it was her inheritance, or a dowry. In addition, it was a common practice among the Jews to prepare a body for burial with this fragrant ointment. Interesting, Lazarus just died. She didn't break it open for him. She could have. That would have been an appropriate use, but she kept it. Why would the writers be vague, about all of that content? Because the people they were expecting to hear this, they would have understood it, because it was a cultural piece, deeply embedded in their culture. They get it. It wasn't an issue. Just like if I say Walmart, we all get it. I don't have to explain what Walmart is. I have no intention of having anybody 2,000 years from now hear this message. It's not happening. I don't think they were thinking, in the year 2021, we got to make sure that those people over in the United States of America, which we don't even know who they are or what that's like, get this. So we're going to write it in such a way that they get it. No, they're writing it for their audience of the day. Okay? It wasn't written to us today. It's the Holy Spirit who allows us to gain insight from the truths back then. Okay, interesting. He says, she broke the jar. Mark says she broke the jar. He's the only one that mentions that. If she broke it, that means it was no longer available as a dowry. If she used it, her future was now different. See how that would work? She broke it. She poured it out. Her future was no longer going to look the same had she kept that. There was an opportunity cost in her action. She gave up something that could last for a lifetime in order to have something that could last for eternity. She poured this perfume on his head and on his feet. Two versions say poured it on his head, one says on his feet. So probably both. Poured it on his head, just like David was anointed by Samuel with the oil on the head, acknowledging he was king of Israel. She poured it on his head, acknowledging, you are the king. You are my king. Amen. And she poured it on his feet. And I am your servant. Her posture and her action communicated her heart attitude. Can you see that? There's a lot more going on here than just dumping out some perfume. When you're sincerely devoted to Jesus, okay, she wiped his feet with her hair, and this fragrance filled the room. In John, he says, she wiped it with her hair, and the fragrance filled the room. So she wipes it with her hair, that fragrance is going to get all over her. When she walks out of that room, it's going to stay with her for quite some time. I don't know how long it would last. But it's when you've met with Jesus and you've been devoted to Jesus, like it's noticeable. People will see that. They will sense it. And then the whole fragrance of it filled the whole room. Everybody was partaking of what she was offering. I'll never forget when I walked into this building in 1996 as a college freshman, and I met people who in their eyes, there was a life that I had never seen before. Because they had met with Jesus. And I looked at them and I was like, oh, I want what they have. I've never seen that before. You know that when you lay it down before the Lord, that goes with you. That's what she was doing. Okay, let's look at the disciples' response. So I'm starting here, Matthew 26, verses 8 and 9. So when the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. In Mark, it says, some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. And John gets a little more specific. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, John just throws him under the bus. It was John. John says, it was Judas, come on. That guy. By this time, John had a lot of time to stew about it too. John wrote his gospel probably later in life, like around 90 AD. He was an old man, and I'm sure he wasn't harboring bitterness, but I would have been. That's right. Just for the record, it was Judas. Okay. Who was later to betray him, objected, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor. Here goes John. See, John knows things, right? He gets to the heart of the matter. He was not saying this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to whatever was put in it. Okay. Well, how'd he know that? Well, somebody was doing the accounting, and they're like, this isn't adding up, We're missing some. Okay. So here, the disciples' response. So interesting to me that, okay, we just talked about how what was written in the scripture was extremely intentional. The details that were included and the details that were excluded were done on purpose. Okay? Matthew and Mark attribute this idea, this attitude, to more than just Judas. How could they possibly do that? I mean, why would they want to do that? They leave it general. The disciples, some of those present, versus just Judas. I think Matthew and Peter in Mark's gospel, possibly what happened is Judas is the one that stood up and said something, but Matthew and Peter sat there and went, hey, yeah, why didn't they? Why didn't we sell it and give it to the poor? Which is why they allowed the generality of saying the disciples or some of those present. Judas stood up and said something about it, but the others stood around and went, yeah, that's what I was thinking too, I just didn't say it. So we're not going to just, so they are more inclusive with this was a general thought that was happening. Indignant, it's a strong emotional response. It's like, huh? What? What are you doing? And really, if I were to read this story from Matthew in ancient times, and you're all here listening, and I get to the part where I say, she brought this alabaster flask, and she poured it all on his head, and you would be all like, huh, what? The whole thing? Yeah, they were indignant. Why this waste? What did Jesus think when they said that? That was a waste? What you give me, that's what you think? It's a waste? Why this waste? It wasn't just Judas who thought it. If I'd venture to guess, some of us might have thought it. Why this waste? We have to be careful what goes through our heart. It could have been sold at a high price for a year's wages and given to the poor. Well, to be fair, that is a noble cause. It's not a horrible strategy. Might even be considered benevolent. Some strategic philanthropy seems Christian-like, doesn't it? Should be. That's actually kind of a good idea. And really, if you think about it, the disciples themselves were probably quite poor. And so the fact that they thought, well, they didn't say, hey, we should have kept that for ourselves to fund our ministry for the next year. They thought, well, we could sell it and we can give to the poor. So there is something somewhat noble in their strategy. It's not terrible. However, that's not what Jesus was after. Let's look at Jesus' response. Matthew 26, 10 through 13. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done also will be told in memory of her. Mark, leave her alone, Jesus said. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And then John, leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. Notice she saved it. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Why are you bothering her? These words, the words that makes up this word bothering in the Greek, it comes from two words, and it means to hold near, and the other word means to labor in pain or to cut. So he's basically saying, why are you taking your pain and bringing it to her? You know, because when you say, that's a waste, that's not what she's thinking, that's your problem. Have you ever seen yourself be critical of someone else's gift? Have you ever been, why that person, they just serve like that because they want to get noticed? That's not their problem. That's your problem. That's not a reflection of their heart. It's a reflection of your heart. Jesus says, she's not having a problem. You are. Why are you taking your pain to her? Yeah. We should do an altar call right now. Be done. But we have this air-conditioned room, so we'll keep going. Okay. Jesus says, she has done a beautiful thing. She has done a beautiful thing. He affirms her action and her unspoken intentions. You see, Jesus, as we know, he speaks to people's heart intentions. He doesn't just speak to the words that they're saying or the actions that they're doing. He goes deeper, and he talks about, he answers questions from their intentions. And so when she says she's done a beautiful thing, he's not just saying this action she did was beautiful. Oh, it was really nice to have the perfume. That was really nice. He's talking about the opportunity cost that she was paying. He's talking about the thing of value that she had that was for her future. That was her dowry, potentially even the relational longing she may have had. Oh, I hope that someday I'll be able to give this to my husband because I long for that security. I long for that comfort. I long for that relationship. But I'm going to give that all up because I'm giving it to you, my Lord, my Savior, and my Jesus. He says that's a beautiful thing. That was a beautiful thing. To lay it down. To use it because she did what she could. It's something she actually had. You know, and Jesus did not ask for it. He never asked her for that. He never took it from her. She offered that. And he says this, she did this to prepare me for my burial. At that point, the disciples should have really been saying, huh, what? You know, he had been talking about how he had to die for the people. Like, this is not the first time that he mentioned it, but about a week from now, he's gone. They did not get it. I think Mary was starting to get it. I think Mary was having this revelation. Maybe it was specifically that thing of value that she had, that she knew this is in between me and God. I need to give it to him. Maybe it was something like that. Maybe it was this idea of I recognize, because Mary's the one that listened, right? Like when we hear about Mary and Martha, right? Martha is serving and she's like, Jesus, tell Mary to help me. And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're worried about many things. But Mary, who was sitting at the feet of Jesus just listening, he says, she's chosen the one good thing. Remember that? Mary was listening. I think at the table here, as Jesus is reclining and they're dialoguing, she's beginning to get it. She's perceiving, she's having this revelation of what's about to happen. He's been talking about dying. He actually means like right now. Like this is coming. What am I going to do? What can I do? What do I have? I can give him my all. I can give him my future. I can give him probably the thing that had the most value to her. I can give that to him and to honor him. She did what she could to prepare him for his burial. She saved the perfume for the day of his burial. So, and then Jesus goes on to say, wherever this gospel is preached, what she has done will also be remembered. What part of it? Pouring out the perfume, breaking the jar, or the laying everything she had before him? Because I think that Jesus knew all of man's best strategies to move this new covenant forward were completely inadequate, and it is never going to be fueled by our strategic effort. It's going to be fueled by our committed devotion completely to him. That's why her story is to be remembered. As Mary's having this revelation, you can't help but wonder, is this just a man-woman thing? Like, she's perceiving something that the guys just don't get. There was a while back, my wife and I, we were both pretty sick, and so we really weren't able to do our kind of normal life around the house, so one of my sons, in his effort to be sensitive to my compromised condition, he says, hey, Dad, do you think you feel well enough to drop me off at the golf course? I thank you, son, for being sensitive to what I might not be ready to do that, so I appreciate you, asking gently. My daughter, on the other hand, she goes into our bedroom and strips the sheets and washes them and puts new sheets on the bed because she's perceiving this is a difficult time. I'm going to help out, do something. I'm going to do what I can. You see, guys and girls, they're just different, They are just different. It's a good thing. Okay, Judas's response. So this response is only recorded in Matthew and Mark. John does not go on to describe any of these details. It says, then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Mark. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this, and they promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Judas's response is, what are you willing to give me? There's got to be something more valuable than what I have right now. 30 pieces of silver, that was approximately the price of a slave at the time. It was maybe about 100 days' wages. It's not a small sum of money, but it seems like Jesus would be worth more than that, but not to Judas. Not to Judas. He watched for an opportunity to hand him over. He kept being present. Like he wasn't done being in their presence. But in his heart, he was not present. It's really easy to do Christian things. It's really easy to walk into church and be present without a heart that is laying it down before Jesus. Judas, he provides an example. So in conclusion here, as we read this story from a morally historical perspective, indeed, 3 examples emerge. mistakes to avoid, and an example to follow. Number one, we have the brazen Judas. I'd rather have the money than Jesus. I'd rather have anything the world has to offer than what I've got here. He just didn't see it. Number two, we have the bothered, the disciples. They're thinking, well, we have Jesus, so really we want to have Jesus and. Can't we have Jesus and this thing of value? Because then we can strategize and we can make it all work, right? We can have both. He's here now, so it's fine. It'll all work. And then we have the beautiful Mary. Jesus is worth more than anything I own. He didn't ask for her all, she willingly gave it. You know, she's saying, we might be saying, Lord, I'm committed to you, but right now I'm really concerned. I'm really concerned about my marriage. I'm concerned about my children. I'm concerned about my job. I'm concerned about relationships. I'm concerned about my finances. I'm committed to you, Lord, but I'm really concerned. Isn't there a way that we can reconcile this? Can't we strategize and make this work? Can't we just settle this? Can we settle it over a pint? And Jesus says, yeah, we can. Pour it out. Pour it out. Acknowledge him as the head. Acknowledge him as the king. And lay it down at his feet, knowing that, Lord, you are my Lord and my life is yours. These things that I'm concerned about, they're your concerns too. I'm going to leave them to you. And Jesus says, this is a beautiful thing. This is a beautiful thing. The type of thing that my kingdom is built upon. This is the type of thing that will be remembered for all eternity. You know, as you lay down something that may affect the rest of your life, you will actually pick up something that will affect the rest of eternity. Pour it out. Acknowledge his lordship. Let the hope overwhelm you. It will change what you cannot change. It will change what you cannot change. We might have all kinds of strategies to employ to make life work. But what we actually need is to lay it all down before him, to do a beautiful thing in his eyes. To go, Lord, all of my strategies, they're yours. All of my strategies, they are yours. And then be overwhelmed with the hope that he brings, because it will change what you cannot change. All right, well, we'll turn it over to our closers here.